suggest reasons why it will likely go well. Second, we'll explain the pernicious problem of the influence in France in these former colonies and why the continued capital expenditure there is not in their interest. Third, we'll explain the benefits of capital reallocation. And finally, geopolitics, French image, that fun stuff. Let's model first. I think what this withdrawal looks like is it looks like the removal of French soldiers from places like Mali and places where they operate as peacekeepers, as well as the removal of French government officials that have enduring positions of influence in West Africa and in other former French colonies. Note that in that transition period, we move the diplomats currently in government or peacekeeping positions and move them elsewhere. Insofar as France spends large amounts of money toward that in terms of military and political expenditure, we do think this represents a large capital allocation shift within both the French foreign aid budget, as well as within the French military budget and French government expenditures more broadly. What we envision taking place, and this is the second point of model, is a staggered withdrawal over a period of months to years. Obviously, this doesn't look like France picking up their armed forces and relocating them in immediate terms. If instability in Mali is on the rise, we wager this looks like a phase out gradually depending on the relevant risk factors for each country. Thus, we think that the withdrawal from Côte d'Ivoire probably happens prior to the withdrawal from Mali. We think the withdrawal from, say, Algeria happens faster than the withdrawal from Mali, but generally speaking, we're happy to calibrate that depending on the status quo within that country. The final thing I think this does, I'll take that in a moment, is it looks like reorientation away from the economic dependency on France that characterizes the current state of these former colonies. For example, we've actively encouraged countries that still pledge allegiance to the French flag, or French diplomatic officials embedded in their government that determine economic policy to be removed over that period of time. Crucially, this doesn't mean we still don't do trade deals. We still don't do some degree of bilateral engagement. We think that insofar as those deals are in the interest of French people, those will continue to be negotiated on a case-by-case basis. We think those still exist. This is about the withdrawal of them, their government influence, and the withdrawal of economic dependency that is created by those officials closing.
Just so I get this straight on this whole staggered pullout thing, if you guys pull out from Mali, terror tax going up, do you keep staying?
No, we leave eventually. The point is we're going to do it over a period of time to give time for the officials and the development of that state to develop within that set period of time. And we're modeling specifically that we're going to use those officials currently there to begin reorienting those states away from the status quo of dependency. That is to say, we're going to use the time period within that withdrawal to set up a form of government insofar as they're dependent on French officials to be less dependent on French officials within that period of time. What is the problem in the status quo of French influence in West Africa? The first is that the investment of military and political resources there is very costly. The first is that the US and China are competing fairly rapidly in West Africa in terms of economic investment at relatively rapid speeds. This looks like initiatives like Belt and Road, for example, on the part of China. It looks like the US desire to counter China globally, precipitating mass investment on their part. And it looks like new investment opportunities in the energy market from European countries and the US as a result of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Note that China and the United States have significant capital and resources. We think that over time, as their economic largesse grows massively, this eclipses France's influence politically. That is to say that over a period of time, this becomes a sunk cost for France insofar as other actors have significantly more capital to engage in expenditure and economic ties that they can utilize towards these countries one way or another that France cannot match, because at a certain stage, the political officials within those contexts gain less influence than the state that's ultimately paying the bill. So over a period of time, it's likely that France's influence will be eclipsed within these colonies. But secondly, a managed withdrawal is necessarily it means there's less of a sunk cost, right? So as their economic influence wanes, we save money in that regard. The second problem is this has created institutional dependency of numerous African states on French largesse. What does this look like? I think firstly, it looks like a legacy of colonialism, that those institutions started on the back foot and never had a chance to develop. It looks like stagnation on the part of the French state and an absence of interest in the French state committing resources toward that transition period, meaning that that never happened. Look at French colonial laws enacting discriminatory legal codes on ethnic minorities within those states, like the Ahmed in Algeria, for example. What we do is in the period of time following withdrawal, giving time for the French who want to lead these colonies the best state as possible to build up those institutions to the extent that they're able to remain stable. We are not naive. We are not going to say this solves every problem. But we do think this does. They kickstart the process that should have had many, many years ago. That is, we get the institutional buildup to leave these states in the best state possible. That never happened on their side of the house as the status quo persists in perpetuity. The second thing I think this does is it largely just increases the French image on the international stage, right? This is fairly intuitive, but insofar as the French people likely are getting, dinged by the local left for continuing to engage in colonial practices and things like this probably burnishes their image to an extent, which has some degree of reputational benefit for the French people. The second major claim I want to make is impacting the capital reallocation. Note that even if you believe that the French influence could still do good in these colonies, and it's unclear why it is the case that they could do good in these colonies, I think that the reallocation is likely to be significantly more in the interest of French people. The first thing I think this does is a large amount of capital reallocation likely happens for things that benefit the French people to a vastly greater degree. Why is this expenditure likely to be done well? The first is that there are electoral incentives that exist within the French state. That is to say, Macron wants to be reelected to avoid, for example, the French far right coming to power or losing his position. And I'd wager generally French presidents have this electoral incentive regardless of whether Macron remains in power over a period of time. But secondly, note that the Russia-Ukraine war and the massive energy crisis crisis precipitating throughout Europe, which France notably has been affected less so because they are dependent on nuclear plants rather than others, means that it is likely that there is a large degree of instability economically and politically within Europe more broadly. This means that insofar as you get more capital expenditure towards these things, what this then means is you increase the level of stability within those countries to a greater extent. The third thing is competition, right? Insofar as other EU member states are promising amenities to their citizens over time to preempt the energy crisis and things like this, and preempt the expenditure of Russia-Ukraine war and inflation that arises from that, it's very likely that the French electorate will hold their politicians to account in that regard. The implication of this is we get vastly better social services spending both within France and greater resilience as a consequence for economic problems and potential calamities that could result as an result of exogenous economic shocks. So I think that's a massive benefit that we get to claim on our side of the house just as a result of that expenditure. Before I go on, open it.
You just framed for us why the world is in a particularly unstable state. Why is now a good time for France to do this?
Yeah, because the world is in an unstable state. As the French have the highest obligation to their people. Insofar as they have the highest obligation to their people, as opposed to former colonies, it's better to allocate money for the people who will vote them out of power otherwise, even if it's incentive to the government. Why is it the case that this won't leave behind a massive power vacuum? Because this might be the opposition challenge. They're going to say, oh, there will be a big power vacuum, they'll leave, that would be bad. First, as I've already framed, China and the US, who have incentives to be able to trade with these countries, are likely to come in and engage in a degree of influence on their side of the house. Note that insofar as this influence degree is likely to be economic rather than embedded within the government, because they can't just go in and revise the entire political system or revise the constitution, as the French have this legacy within the system in the first place, but also it would look quite bad for the United States to go in, overthrow the government, meddle with those things, and it's not clear that that's proportionate either. It's unlikely that that occurs on their side of the house, but also, and this is crucial, insofar as the French pull out now, you mitigate the degree of resentment that those former colonies feel. Note that in the status quo, a large amount of instability is driven by radicals within those populations that feel an extreme amount of animosity toward the French and continued European influence within those states. At the point at which the French withdraw, defang those populist elements mean they lose power. This means the rebound happens less on the French populace. It means there's less radicalism from expatriate populations within France that can cause potential problems and radicalization, agitation, and things like this. We minimize that as well. On the economic front and the political front, incredibly proud to stand in OG.
I thank the Prime Minister for that speech, and now I'd like to welcome up Leader of the Opposition.
All ready? I agree with the metric that we got from Matt just as we entered the 6th minute, which is this is about what's best for the French domestic populace. And I think the ways in which we extract economic and political value from our colonies are what brings the value to that French populace. Because note, this is an active debate, so it's not about, as Matt said in his speech, doing good. Rather, it is about what is doing the best thing for France. Not always what's best in the anti-colonial sense, don't reflect my personal beliefs, but it is in terms of the colonial that we're talking about. First, I want to challenge his characterization that this involves military withdrawal. I simply don't think this is the focus of the debate. Why? One, if we're talking about UN peacekeepers, those UN forces are going to be present regardless because of static obligations France has to the UN. Secondly, I don't think that France has a lot of domestic troops there for 2 reasons. One, the history of French colonies are wildly different than I think how we reduce like African nations in debate. When we're talking about countries like Cote d'Ivoire, when we're talking about like Nigeria, Morocco, these are all flourishing democracies that have been economically and politically stable for a long time, which means 2 things. One, they have the political apparatus to kick back against high military presence, but 2, it just means there's simply a less need for it. Like, when was the last time that you heard about a massive terror attack in Morocco? When was the last time you heard about a massive terror attack in Cote d'Ivoire? The reason being they just have a much better capacity to enact this on their own. Third reason is that it conjoins, and this is a key framing for the debate, with the approach to French colonialism. They framed themselves against English colonialism as a better comparative because this was a great optics and branding thing for them to do. But importantly, they also did this because it conjoined with French cultural intuitions about paternalism. Because yes, it is paternalistic, but it's paternalistic as mediated through a laissez-faire philosophy that when we support people with the things that they need, they were able to flourish on their own, which is why historically there's been less military presence. But it's also note why these countries have done economically better because it was less about authoritarian militaristic boots as it was about the types of economic support that we provide them to create bilateral benefits. What are those bilateral benefits? First, when it comes to the ways in which we are positioning ourselves as a state within rising anti-colonial sentiments, I think France is doing a great job and is usually not under the crosshairs. Why? 2 key reasons. I think the first is that we're able to meet the types of deliverables that other states are not. France is able to make large sweeping public apologies, sending reparations money, sending dignitaries like it did a couple of years ago in ways that the UK and the US are not, or just like politically aren't able to do, which makes them look like a comparatively far better actor, and it legitimizes the domestic propaganda that they have in these states about why they are a more legitimate actor than some of their comparatives. But I think the second thing is that they also reframe this as a modality of reparations. This is really sneaky, but really effective for France, because they say our presence is not colonialism. Our presence is how we give back for what we did during colonialism, is this continued support that fulfills our reparative duties. And this segues into my first case about why it is that the general French populace supports us being in France. First stakeholder, progressives. I think they buy into this idea that the ways in which we are present, support them not with military boots on the ground, but rather with economic enjoyment, functions as a modality of reparations that satiates what they think France's duty is back. Two, I think you have diaspora communities like friends and family friends that I have in France, because I have lots of French family, that see themselves as straddling the divide between where they came from and where they currently live now. And that's how they've constructed their cultural identities at the juncture between those two sources and ways of living. And the ways in which they would perceive France to be doing this would be a direct attack on who they see themselves as, how they define their communities. It would also just materially make it more difficult for them to visit. It would also make it materially more difficult for them to maintain, for example, the types of multilateral businesses that they have that work across both of these countries when there are less favorable trade deals, or when we're no longer able to allocate special economic zones within these areas to facilitate specifically diaspora communities, which again, France brands as a form of reparations, but also just materially benefits them. I think thirdly, it comes to conservatives. And I think this is where we flip the OG case on this. There are two reasons why this is better for conservatives. First, conservatives are frothing at the mouth about the high levels of migrants that we have in France. What a withdrawal is experienced or perceived by them as means that there's going to be more conflict left behind. No, that's not true as per my earlier analysis, but that is their fear, which means they will oppose the withdrawal because they think they have reductive ideas of these colonies and things will implode when we leave, and that will draw more migrants in. The second reason is because of Brexit. There's rising anti-EU sentiment all around Europe, and France meaningfully saying we can leave a mutual sovereignty and governance agreement we have with another state greatly galvanizes the radical far right who are conjoining and galvanizing themselves through anti-Brexit narrative rhetoric. No, this is particularly important, no, because of the recent close election between Marine Le Pen and Macron, which means that the leadership of France is particularly invested in galvanizing as much support they can across mutual stakeholders, but particularly in terms of suppressing rising and far right sentiment. The second political reason why it's important simply has to do with like presence in the UN. When you have these special and direct and most salient economic relationships with these states, you're allowed to ask things on the back end. Things like supporting us in the UN when we try and make more favorable fishing agreements around your waters that benefit our ships and not Chinese ships. This also translates to things like rights decisions about whether we invade certain countries or not based on a General Assembly vote, all of which you lose or give up by withdrawing from these countries. Note, I then flip what's interesting about this Chinese expansionism point, because if you're worried about Chinese expansionism, the worst thing you can do is leave. The worst thing you can do is create an opportunity for China to come in and then create instrumental, manipulative, BRI, low interest rate policies that then spike up in future years and create debt trap that then force those colonies to renege on the types of unique advantages they had been affording to France before. China then strangleholds them into removing the trade benefits, strangleholds them into removing the special economic zones they have with France, and instead prioritize Chinese companies, Chinese people, and Chinese economic centers instead. Yes, Claude.
What's more important to the people of France, a relationship with the EU or a relationship with Africa?
Both, depending on who you are. If it's your relationship with the EU, we don't want to give them ammunition. And if it's a relationship with Africa, we don't want France to come in and say, hey, we're fucking over the company that you have that works multinationally between the two states. Both of which means you have a dual incentive there as the leadership of France to do this. Now, let's talk about economics. I think that this is a massively successful example of neoliberal puppeteering. Why? And this is really important because they proposed that the reason why it's okay to let China come in and leave is because we weren't being economically successful, right? But this is the missing link at OG because they never proved that what we're doing isn't working. 4 reasons why it is. One, because when we withdrew, we put in political leaders who created generational dynasties that have created favorable trade conditions with France. Secondly, because you have the legacy of previous and ongoing conditional aid that has forced them to create certain types of interest rate benefits in terms of the exporting of resources back to mainland France. Thirdly, because we've given them special economic zones that they only access through, again, affording us certain types of economic benefits. And fourth, because of the MNCs that I talked to you about that are easier to maneuver across France and the other colonies that bring economic benefits on both sides. What that means is is we extract an extraordinary amount of economic wealth out of these nations. This, for example, looks like the ability to have far less shipping costs because like Morocco is really close to mainland Europe. And so when you have to spend a lot of money on the refrigeration units to ship certain types of materials that have to be kept cold, you save thousands of dollars by having to be one country closer than it would be in any of the alternative states they're going to pitch that we can do. The second reason I would say is that France is in a particularly economically volatile situation. Matt gave you all the reasons why, which creates demographic backlash from the populace. But why the fuck now are you withdrawing economically from France when we're giving all this money away to all these other places? It's time to settle in the relationship we have, continue to extract them. Your French leadership, that's the conclusion you'd come to.
I thank the leader of the opposition for that speech. Now I'd like to ask Mark to please with this study.
Everybody ready? 3, 2, 1. The buckets of blood that we've spilled are no longer in our interest. Their case might have applied in the 60s, 70s, 80s, maybe even the 90s. What I'm going to frame to you right now is that the international arena is no longer a place for us to succeed within these contexts, and that there is a direct trade-off for us sinking our money within them. I want to do a piece of framing before getting into direct rebuttal. It is likely that the US or China or another powerful actor will try and succeed to push us out. Why is it likely that they do this? One, the strategic military importance insofar as they can use it for counterintelligence against terrorist threats, but also strategic geopolitical interests. Secondarily, important resources that OMO themselves conceive might be important along the supply chain. And yeah, so I think it's enough or sufficient for me to prove to you that these are important places that powerful actors want to come. Why won't, for example, the US just let us control it insofar as we could be like an ally to them? They would want to have direct sphere of influence. One, note that they cannot trust the intelligence that we provide them insofar as we might have competing interests with the US, but secondarily, they cannot trust us fully as an actor insofar as we, for example, betrayed them on the Australia deal with exchanging or buying submarines from Australia when we otherwise promised not. Upshot of this is that there are two very powerful countries that want to be in our place. Now, why do they have the capacity to push us out of that position? One, larger military budgets that appeal to these states insofar as they want to counter the instability that exists. Secondarily, larger economies, which means they have longer time frames to, for example, provide better trade deals, better loan deals, better capital investment. And thirdly, we are more appealing, or they are more appealing as an ally compared to us as France, because they have better military and securities, they have a larger consumer base you can otherwise sell to, access to more allies and more money for loans. What is the strategic implication of this for this round? It is a sunk cost and not a question of whether if we will have to, but when. When will we have to withdraw and accept our losses and cut the losses as soon as possible? Now that that's been proven, I want to explain to you what the direct trade-off of that sunk cost is. It's the reallocation of capital to things that our people, our brethren, our fraternal individuals that reside in our soil depend on. It's reducing taxes to counter unemployment that has increased during COVID insofar as tax rates are notably quite high in the same time to balance. Social services while also attracting capital investment. You freeing up that capital allows you to have to engage in that dichotomy anymore. Secondarily, subsidizing businesses that have been suffering from COVID or unable to compete with the monopolization that has existed for the past decade. Or thirdly, and this is critical, social services. That is, say, directly funding more schools for kids, reducing inequality in areas, just funding more hospitals and more research into medical devices that cure the illnesses of our people. I don't have to go into a number of examples. The point or the illustration of this is there's a lot of money that could go to helping the French people. Why do you care about these impacts and this trade-off substantially more? One, they are the most proximate. That is to say, the government or the influence or the money that the French government would use to otherwise redistribute goes directly to the people. It is directly to them. On their side, they have to do a balancing act where some of it might have to appeal their colonial predecessors, and some of them might benefit the individual in France. With this, all of it is beneficial to the French people. Secondarily, it is the least speculative. On their side, they have to question, will these natural resources be effective or not? Will we or will we not succeed against fighting China or the US? We say the uncertainty, even if it's not proven, it's massive, and it's better in this uncertain arena and a cost-benefit calculus, cut your losses now, as opposed to taking the risk that you lose and you wasted billions on a losing fight that I've explained to you is likely to be losing, even if you don't end up losing it in the first place. You're making the decision from this point and the information you have now. Now, I want to now, if you don't buy that, mitigate the actual benefits they say they provide. Firstly, they say there's important stuff like natural resources, minerals, fisheries, etc. Why is it better to withdraw? Note their natural resources are no longer strategic in this international arena and economic environment. Why? Firstly, China is crowding them out of that insofar as the previous analysis that I've given, insofar as they want more control of the supply chain. But secondarily, this French economy and structure is no longer compatible with the benefits of these resources. That is to say, we don't need the resources, we need the things the resources are necessary to make. So it's like assembly products, or it's like minerals that you need for semiconductors or whatever. The point is that this isn't the 90s anymore. So China and other countries have taken up parts of the supply chain where the part that these African countries operate no longer go directly to us. So us extracting it from them would mean we just have to sell it to somebody else to sell it back to us. So the point is that all of their case is null. We don't need the stuff they talk about because it's a different environment where we cannot utilize it anymore. Secondarily, on instability. That is to say, if there's instability like they talk about, it poisons the money that we put in and it's even more of a sunk cost. Why? Because this looks like French banks, for example, giving poor and high interest loans to countries that are unlikely to pay this money back. So what you do is that you lock us into a losing country. If it's true on their side that there's so much instability, then what that means is that you've sunk in even more money that could go to saving your people, to giving more subsidies to businesses that otherwise needed, or better credit investments, or alternatively, other allies that are more strategic. I don't have to paint you the other alternatives or arenas for where friends can put their dollar to get more allies. Maybe it's Latin America. What I've shown you is that these are no longer strategic and the plethora of alternatives are better. But secondarily, why is the instability likely to increase and it's better for us to withdraw? Before explaining that and the implication of that, which means we should get out now before we end up losing our chips even more, CO.
Yeah, so the US and China compete with France in African territories. Which main country on the planet do they not compete with UN?
The point is fine. If they compete with us somewhere else, let's just take our money, stop trying to win against big giants that are going to crush us regardless, and just invest in our people anyway. The point is what I've shown you, that there is a direct trade-off, and continuing to invest in this is a losing fight that is unlikely to materialize. So even if we can't invest in any sort of other alternative and they'll beat us in like Latin America or Eastern Europe or other countries, the point is fine. Cut our losses. We're not a top superior world power anymore, but let's save our people. Let's give them more money. Let's give more education to the French interest. So even in our worst case, I've shown you it's a better trade-off. Secondarily, if it's the case that there's a lot of instability and we cannot otherwise like withdraw properly, this is even more of a reason for us to get out right now. That is to say, these countries are unlikely if they're unlikely to, for example, succeed with us being there, we're putting more French bodies on the line to die. We're getting more of the baggage that is otherwise associated with a failing military apparatus. In other words, if all want to paint this idea that we can, for example, be these, like, we don't have to be the same colonial past that we otherwise will be. The point is that any negative association is inevitably tied to us because we are seen as responsible. That is to say, we are the ones who failed them. So even if we didn't do anything wrong, we didn't do the right thing or the otherwise better thing. Look, this debate isn't in the 90s anymore. Maybe it was beneficial for us to spill buckets of blood and exploit resources. It's just not strategically more for us now.
I think the Deputy Prime Minister for the speech, and I'd like to ask about the case for the
Yo,
places like Mali, Madagascar, Algeria, Tunisia, Niger, Cote d'Ivoire, those places are going to be the future of the world's economy. I think it's ludicrous that opening governments say that they're going to take this money that they're investing in this and put it towards social services. Because the whole point of our case is the money that you need to fund social services is coming currently for France from Africa. So if we prove that claim, we beat their claim on social services on the comparative. Second thing then is I think that a lot of their claims, note a lot of Ahmed's speech, is reliant on the fact that France is incapable of competing with China and the USA in Africa. There's two problems with this. Firstly, it's untrue, as I'll prove later, and it's a key contingency for all of their Republicans. Secondly, they rely on no alternative being present. Where is France going to invest in a future that they will not be competed with? Why not go into the environment where they already have a structural advantage, as I'll explain later? Thirdly, just briefly, I want to have a note on opening government and how they have a lot of missing birds in the case. I can't run through all of them, but note, for example, the claim in the PM that the USA can't puppeteer states because of optics. That's an unproven claim in a debate. You need to interrogate these claims as a panel when you're running through the debate. Couple of things then. Firstly, just some context. I think that post-1945, a lot of colonial powers left because they couldn't afford to keep funding these kinds of colonies. And what they did is they left particular rulers in power, enfranchised them with wealth, land, resources, and particular political institutions, which co-opted the colonial situation and the colonial arms to maintain the extractive situation of the regime, and negotiated specific deals with France, natural resource allocations, trade deals, codified and continued into the modern era through constitutional requirements, political norms, and campaign financing. The response that we hear, so basically the idea here, that means that France is institutionally better at competing in these areas than China and the USA. So they've set up specific, they have control over the prior regulatory environment into which these companies will compete. They can specify in these instances. The response we get in Ahmed's speech is that these countries have larger military budgets. No analysis as to why military budgeting is the reason why countries want investment, why they want that kind of protection, especially if there's sufficiency in the French peacekeepers under the status quo. Secondly, they say you can get better deals in investment. Again, this doesn't deal with the fact that the prior military or the prior situation is one in which this is not going to be a relevant factor in the consideration of the people making these decisions, because it comes after, not before, our analysis. I also just like to note that even in those instances, you can do things like specifying and specializing into specific genres in those areas. They say that the resources that you get from these areas are no longer important for you. No analysis as to why this is the case, really. They just said it. And I think that the reality is that it's not true, because they want things like labor for production of small businesses. They say China has competed and stolen that. Again, that already disproven that. But you can also things like food, which China is not extracting from Africa to the same extent in those areas. It's also things like returns on investment on small businesses in those areas, because you can control the regulatory environment within those contexts. So they say you're unlikely to get the way back in these kinds of loans, but they give no analysis as to why this is the case. It's just based off some sort of conception of Africa as a place that cannot ever be a good place for investment, which is completely assertive in the context of the case. Sorry, just by the way, I'd like to know, I know that Josh got a couple of names of countries wrong. I want to just note that I think it's important to say those kinds of things in debates. I'm trying to be more accurate in my speech. Cool. So, anyways, also, what about all the French businesses that are currently operating within Africa? Because the history we've talked about, there's a lot of French capital already enshrined within institutions within the African states, meaning that you just completely tank them. And those are people who are French people who you care about, we care about as well, because of the way that this debate is worded. And therefore, it's an important thing. And those places cannot get capital back. What about the fact that when you pull out the peacekeepers, you'll suddenly get things like migrant crises, if their characterization is true, coming into Africa, taking all the social services, the precious ones that they want in their case? What about the fact that that is going to reflect poorly on them? Think when they say about optics internationally, think of the way that America was framed after the pullout of Afghanistan as being negative. They gave no proof of the success case of this, aside from assertions within Matt's speech. So that cannot stand in this debate. What is the importance of this argument in the context of what I've just told you? Now, it means that this is a particularly good deal, because the only alternative for domestic expenditure requires funds for it, a long-term investment. Why is it that France is able to get a particularly good deal in these instances? We can get things like tight and conditional loans within the environment, so that you can get specific concessions or changes of institutions which make these countries being able to flourish in the future. Matt's speech said that these countries can flourish if they change their institutions. We are saying that France has the capacity and incentive to change those institutions. Therefore, via Matt's speech, we beat Matt's speech. Now, other things in those on those kinds of claims. You have control over the regulatory environment and political norms of the area. So if you want to set it up so it's specifically beneficial for the kinds of investments that you can make in France and get benefits from it, you're able to do that as France. This is the history of neocolonialism. The corollary of the case is that France does not benefit and is indeed just giving aid to these countries, which flies in the face of the history of the neocolonial state of France. It also means you're likely to get things like capital flight from France, which because of the fact that there's now a perception that they're going to be losing out on money within those instances. It's also a self-fulfilling prophecy, because things like the World Bank bank, which set up the data on what countries are good to invest in, are relying on perceptions of investors, which in the instances where France has more control, because the World Bank itself being a neo-colonial institution, means that it's going to be seen as a good opportunity for investment. You invest in things like education, the schools, business, the jobs, all those kinds of things.
If you can't have both, as France, would you choose the EU and all the benefits that come with that, or your relationship with the African nations?
I understand your question, right? So you would probably favor the EU. I just don't think that the trade-off is as substantial as you would want here, like just to be reasonable. But the problem is that you're not going to lose your relationship with the EU as a consequence of this motion, because other countries also engage in colonial histories and are engaging in modern colonialism. The EU is massively dependent on the capital that France has given it in order to do things like recovering from COVID and that kind of thing, which is important because they want to maintain the current situation because the economic quality of the EU is the thing that ties them all together. Economics is the most important thing in this debate because of the fact that of the material that Josh gave you, the fact that because of COVID and the current supply chain crisis and that kind of thing, the most proximate interest of the French people and thus the French government and thus this motion is the economic interest of the debate. If we've proven these kinds of things, we're more likely to get we have to do the video. I think we're fine. So which means that overall that's the most important thing the context of this debate in terms of weighing is why you're going to have to engage in those kinds of things. You get exceptionally good deals from these countries, but it's also specific deals that your economy has structurally, historically, since the 1800s been reliant on, insofar as you always had things like trade deals going from specific areas, always had returns on investment, those kinds of things, always had these links set up. So you need a total restructuring of your economy to be able to engage with the material from opening government, which you cannot do in the context of instability internationally, which is opening government's very own framing as the reason why they're going to be losing out on this debate. So we've proven to you in opening opposition a couple of key things. France is a specifically good regulatory environment within these countries to be able to maintain an extractive situation in which the economy of France is going to be able to continue forward going into the future. We explained to you why economics is the most important class within this debate, because it's the function of the way in which France can interact with the world, right? Everything that France wants to do, any of the social services stuff from OG, or even just things like putting out political campaigns within the EU, closing opposition want to run that, are all reliant on France's ability to generate income and maintain stability of their assets going forward into the future. It's the stability that we're able to maintain on our side of the house, with the ability to maintain control over it. Like I can't keep saying the same thing again and again, but really and truly, I think it's terrible for opening government engagement. It's why I'm very proud to stand beside the house.
I thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for that speech and everyone for that top half of the debate. We now welcome up the Member of Government.
You don't want me to-
I was ready for the next music video.
Great card. Fine, you can do something for me. I think the debate thus far has been sort of shit, in the sense that we've only talked about economics when we talk about Africa. I understand that lots of people don't know much about Africa. I'm not gonna be like, I'm an African expert, but I would posit that when a country decides to leave an entire continent, that there are other things at stake as well. And we're probably gonna talk a bit more about national security as well, and other stuff that happens in the international arena. But before that, I think lots of this debate is also down to framing, and I'm going to talk about two specific pieces of framing that this debate requires. The first thing is, why now? Like nobody's sort of understood why this question is about now. I know Ahmed wants to talk about the 70s and the 80s, but there's three specific reasons why this is the shittiest time to leave Africa. The first reason is COVID just happened and African countries still haven't come back. The second reason is within the Sahel region, over the past 3 years, we've had 2 political military coups. The third reason is that Islamist groups are on the rise and over 5,000 people have died last year in the Sahel region alone due to terrorist groups coming up. It's amazing that they haven't been talked about. I would suggest that no, thank you, that the French are going to be seen as saviors if they decide to stay and not only fight these terrorist groups, but also invest in infrastructure development. And a lot on that later on when I talk about France and its international presence. The second thing I want to talk about is what the fuck happens to Africa after we leave? I recognize that France is the actor in this motion, but let's just consider what happens. In terms of the violence that I've just mentioned, I would suggest that the violence goes up manifestly for 2 key reasons. One, French military presence is a very big deterrent in the sense that if Islamist troops kill French military soldiers or damage French military assets, they fear the retaliation that comes with it. The second thing that I would note is that France is technologically, the military is technologically and organizationally much better than the smaller groups that are propping up. So it's easier in terms of a cost benefit analysis to not attack them and therefore not attack civilians, etc., but also industry that is there. The third thing I want to talk about is just very simply, this is sort of an Afghanistan situation. You fucking leave, there is going to be a power vacuum. There are I don't know how many ethnic and religious divisions in the area where past histories of colonialism mean that these people sort of hate each other. I would suggest that this leads to a lot of decentralized violence also happening on the streets, not just between 2 parties, but between fucking 15 parties at the same time. No, thank you. This brings me on to the first thing that I want to very quickly get done with in terms of just my weighing. Why is this security analysis important to this debate? Now, opening government suggests that France can make money otherwise, and we're already going out because of the competition that the US and China are bringing up. Opening opposition says, here's a plethora of benefits that French MNCs, etc., accrue because of French presence in the area. Opening opposition doesn't do the mechanistic analysis for why French military and diplomatic withdrawal also means that French MNCs who have built complex, well-built and profitable supply chains will also leave. Like these companies will not have an incentive to leave just because the military has left. I give you analysis for why, if the security situation becomes much worse, these companies do not have the safety to invest within the region anymore. So all of your mining projects, etc., get taken away at the point at which this happens, which is why I would suggest that we, well, on the basis of just like, I guess, logic, our argument is required to sustain their argument. And therefore, in terms of weighing, we take all the economic stuff. Now I'll move on to more interesting new stuff, which is France's international presence and reputation. I would note that the first thing that happens over here is media scrutiny increases. Unfortunately, because of racism, I guess, we don't really give a shit about Africa when it comes to international media presence and talk about Africa. Just compare the articles in Ukraine versus, I guess, Somalia, where a lot more people are dying. I would suggest that this manifestly increases the coverage of Africa, but the coverage isn't going to be nice, because at the point at which you are likely to believe that the security situation gets much worse and these countries are economically very shit, I would suggest that a lot of the blame in the international media space goes to France. And this is going to be an issue that I'll delve into impacting later on. The second thing I want to note is that local resentment against the French also increases at the point at which they know that France left and violence increased. There is great causality there that they can identify. At this point, if you want to, in the future, re-enter these markets, it is going to be even more difficult for you to do so. The third thing I will point out, before that, I will take opening.
we very explicitly modeled, check your notes, that this is a military and political withdrawal. MNCs likely stay regardless. We gave you significant structural reasons as to why it is the case that this ball will be done in a staggered, well-managed way. Why doesn't French have the capacity to?
Lovely. Take up you as quickly as you speak, in the debate. Firstly, very simply, I would just suggest that terrorists tend to increase violence as you leave. You could leave in 10 years and they could be silent for those 10 years, but as soon as you leave, they have incentives to increase violence because nobody's checking the violence. It's the same thing that happened in Afghanistan. So yes, your MNCs do get fucked. All right, cool. Moving quickly on to the next thing that the security situation does, and this I think also goes against the CG thing about, oh, the EU, we love the EU. Well, there is a fucking refugee crisis that is going to happen at the point at which you escape an entire continent. I would want to note the salience of this point. When Syria happened, the EU nearly broke. You had Brexit, you had the rise of anti-European sentiment all across Europe. At the point at which France, which is probably the only stable actor within the region, keeping the peace, leaves, I would suggest a lot more refugees go towards Europe. Who do European hardliners at this point blame for what is happening to them and their countries? I would suggest that the blame goes towards France, and also uniquely towards France, because France, Germany, and the UK are already great targets for smaller countries which already want to leave the EU. I would suggest France's position in the EU becomes greatly damaged. What does this affect? First of all, because of the reputational damage that I've mentioned in the past, but also because of this specific allegation against them. Your ability to make trade deals with everyone in the world goes down because their diplomats are right-wing politicians who do not want to agree deals with you. Or even in a scenario where you get deals, I would suggest that those deals are much worse for you because your bargaining power is gone to shit. I would also note, the last thing I would note is in terms of your alliances, in terms of national security. France, I guess, like, if we're being realistic, France is a bit of a shit member of the P5, right? Like, nobody really gives a fuck about France. The only reason we care is because France has some significant presence within Africa. These countries listen in terms of the Six Eyes Agreement as well, because France is able to provide national security level intelligence about terrorist groups within that framework to the US, to the UK. I would suggest your existence as an international player becomes greatly damaged. What is the overall impact of your existence as an international player going down? One, OG is incorrect. You do not enter other markets because your reputation does not allow you to do so. Two, the new cost of entering new other markets also goes down, i.e. your trade deals become worse, your national security deals become worse, and the only thing that you're left with is a refugee crisis. Good luck with the social welfare money that you saved.
I thank the opposition member for that speech, and I'd like to ask about government. Yeah.
I'm gonna say some stuff.
You won't be on video.
I wanted to create a flag, yeah.
You were on video. Oh.
Just as Taha for mentioning Western Syria and Afghanistan as legitimate examples of global South countries with ethnic divisions and also terror groups, but also talk about Ireland as a legitimate analogy within this debate. Is a sort of strategy applied by closing government. I'm going to do three things in this debate. First, I'm going to show to you why our analysis wins against the opening opposition. First, I think it's important to understand that opening government explicitly framed this as a diplomatic and military withdrawal. That has nothing to do with how multinational corporations interact with this debate, which is the primary benefit claimed by opening opposition. Hence, in order to unlock the benefits of the economic benefits that opening opposition wants, you also have to show that these people are also leaving in addition to the diplomatic and military people. Taha gives you a bunch of reasons for that, which get no engagement from Lucy, which are A, if your security situation gets worse, then multinational corporations are much more likely to exit. Two, this might very well have to do with a broader law and order situation by virtue of contract obligations, contract upkeep, as coups are happening in these countries, left, right, and center. What that means then is that multinational corporations only have incentives to stay if the diplomatic and military stuff stays, which means economic benefits are contingent on proving the diplomatic and military stuff. The second reason that we win against opening opposition then is because we also prove that they really can't go back. And we do this in two ways. First, we say that you are significantly more screwed putting France in the headlines at this point where you're like, they've been in there since 2013 and not a lot of people are talking about it, but you're like, let's do an 8-year withdrawal. And let's show the New York Times and every single human rights agency this is going to be in the news cycle. But secondarily, what would be the political capital to ever go back if you want to unlock these economic benefits? I think that are here important. Number three, I think Taha gives you legitimate reasons for why military and security interests are critical towards France's broader international influence. Here, Lucy did have some engagement. When he mentioned Afghanistan and Western Syria, and Taha gave no structural reasons. The first structural reason that Taha gave was that when you're fighting against a superior military force, you are less likely to attack that specific region. I didn't know that we now also have to prove fucking gravity. Her response to this was, well, the more powerful the military is, the more likely you are to attack them, which for me defies reason and defies debate. I just think if you are much more likely to be killed by an external force, you are less likely to attack them and also less likely to attack the people that they are fundamentally protecting. Their second response to this was, well, they are there specifically because they want France out. No reason for why this is true. Are you talking about Al-Shabaab? Are you talking about ISIL? Are you talking about Al-Qaeda in the Sahel region? No analysis. Well, the IRA wanted the Brits out. I think there's a fundamental difference between Ireland and Africa insofar as there are several Islamist divisions, as Taha explicitly talked about, which are French agnostic. This is about things to do with Africa, and they might have opposition to the French staying insofar as they stop them from achieving their political objectives, but it's not intrinsically their objectives. Hence, I think this is fundamentally important. Then Taha does a few things to show that international influence is important in the final way up against opening opposition. A, you are no longer a big player on the international stage because you don't own some poor countries. It's usually important to have a few of those in your pocket if you want discussions at the World Bank and the United Nations, the IMF, other international fora, and accrue much major influence. Secondly, Taha shows to you that as divisions go up and this French military and diplomatic withdrawal, the pressure to take some refugees surely goes up because you've just withdrawn from a country, just like what happened with every country that the Western power has withdrawn from in the last 65 years, but we still need structural reasons for some reason. So when these refugees start pouring in, the Europeans are pretty pissed off about this. Taha then had 90 seconds of analysis on how Syria happened in 2014, 2015, and nearly broke the European Union. The only response to this from closing government was France is pretty instrumental to the EU's importance. So was the fucking United Kingdom. And things happen. And when bad things happen, then people leave and then the European Union gets so much fucking worse. But the final thing he says is the national security objectives are super important in this debate. Everything to do with the proliferation of Islamic terrorism, everything to do with WMD, everything to do with Six Eyes intelligence. France has a room in these discussions fundamentally because it has stakes within this region. But the point at which you leave like this, you not only discredit yourself in the eyes of the most important players within the international community, but you also create inherent skepticism amongst the global south and across the global south that the French will come in, they will take your resources and then they will leave. That is a sort of skepticism that will neglect economic deals forever. Before I engage them with opening government, go ahead.
Your case is contingent so far as it affects France on another actor like the US or China not filling in the security gap, or French presence being the difference between instability and stability that the US was in Afghanistan. You're speculative, CG repeats us and the EU stuff is irrelevant, and doesn't understand the difference between states and withdrawal. We get it.
He actually spoke parts of this time. But these are the things here. One, so the national security strategy for the Biden administration came out in October last year. The Sahel region is mentioned 0 times because the US would not be fucked about this region. The people who are actually at stake here are China, A, because they have massive cobalt and other mineral deposits, and 2, they have 7% of the world's uranium. So I think that's kind of important. So when China steps in, I really do think it's security agnostic. This is exactly what happened in Pakistan, where the only points where China's interest intersect with national security interest was when the terrorists were directly bombing their pipeline. Outside of that, the Chinese could not be screwed what's happening in these countries. So yes, that US-China analysis does not make sense and terrorism gets much, much worse. But secondarily, also on opening government, I think it's important to realize that if you want economic influence, then A, we've shown to you that there will be a refugee problem. 2, we've shown to you that you have less influence at the international table. But 3, we've shown to you that this idea of drawing a spotlight on France for 10 years is not a great way to get economic deals. On political hegemony then, I think opening opposition does a great job of saying that, like, you know, there are reasons why the left might still want to stay there and different things. I think the basic reason is that the left has learned that liberal non-interventionism is a horrible principle by virtue of what happened in Syria, by virtue of what happened in Iraq, by virtue of what happened in Afghanistan. They realize that it's probably screwed up to go, but it's even more screwed up to leave. That's the summary of the left opinion. That was very loud. And I think that's super, super important. But secondarily, Taha also does a great job of talking about the African diaspora, where he shows you that inherent resentment amongst these people is a bit more complicated than pro-French, anti-French. So the sentiment is you went into these countries unfairly, and now you've taken over our countries, and now you're going to leave. When Taha showed you, we are at our worst because of COVID, because of conflict, because of coups. You're going to leave us at our weakest, and then you're going to leave. That panel is a recipe for political disaster and mass instability. I am so proud to oppose.